Hello, Marian.
Good morning, Hannah.
Great talk yesterday. I'm looking forward to it today too.
Oh, thank you.
It's an interesting and very important overview.
Thank you, thank you. Well, you'll be able to spot the differences, see what I miss out this time. Good morning, Winsy.
Hi, Marian.
Hannah, this is Winsy Wong, who is doing our newsletter now. This Hannah Simonsen from Norway, Winsy. Yeah. She is involved in the, she's leading the early stage researcher group.
Yeah.
Yeah, great to be a team to be part of.
Well, we're very fortunate to have you, Winsy.
Yes, it's great.
I'll try my best.
So Hannah or Ruth, shall I make one of you co-host again? Because that was really helpful last time.
Yeah, that's no problem, Marian. I can let people in.
It's good.
Okay.
You do a repetition of yesterday, huh?
I was speaking to someone who attended yesterday afterwards, Marian, and she said it was the best online presentation she had ever been at.
Hi, good morning.
There you go.
How many has she been at? Thank you, Ruth. Thank you. Sorry. Hello, Santa. Nice to see you.
Hello, good morning. You were talking, so I didn't want to interrupt.
No,
nice to see you too. Thank you.
Chef,
hello.
Hello.
Lovely to see you.
And you.
It's not 8 yet, Marian, so I think.
No, that's okay.
Yeah. Morning, Claire. Nice to see you.
Hi, Ruth. Nice to see you too. How are you?
I'm good, thanks. Looking forward to this presentation.
Absolutely.
So, Marian, we'll follow the same format if that's okay. Hannah will introduce you and I'll keep an eye then on the chat.
Great, thanks.
I think since it's 8 o'clock or 9 o'clock or whatever clock, I think we might start.
Sure.
Yeah. So Ruth and I are very happy to present Marian to you today on her masterclass on systematic reviewing and meta-analysis. She has a long experience in this field. She's been a Cochrane methodological editor since 2009, an editor for Cochrane Stroke since 2013, and a Cochrane associate editor since 2016. And she has completed more than 25 Cochrane reviews across a broad range of clinical topics, and then published more than 50 reviews, including methodological and narrative reviews, overviews of reviews, mixed methods, and several review updates. And she has a range of data synthesis experience, including paired comparisons, network meta-analysis, and individual participant data analysis. So, and as you will notice in the talk, she perceives systematic reviews as key to facilitating access to high-quality summaries of the available evidence on a topic for people with aphasia, healthcare professionals, and researchers. So the floor is yours, Marian.
Great, thank you so much, Hannah and Ruth, for the opportunity to share with you some of my thoughts on systematic reviewing and meta-analysis today. I'm just going to share my screen, folks. I hope that's okay, just so you can see the slides. Okay. So I'm just making sure I can see my slides too. There we go. So I'm going to be talking about systematic reviews and to a lesser extent meta-analysis, but the emphasis more is on the systematic review element. I discovered I'd have a lot to say about a topic that's really close to my heart. The focus is for early stage researchers and junior researchers. It is on methodological training. So I am assuming a basic understanding of the systematic review process, and I'm working to build on that from there. So I'm going to start with introducing this man. His name is John Dewey, and many of you will know him from the context of being one of the co-founders of the philosophical movement around pragmatism. And he said that science is a systematic means of gaining reliable knowledge. And I think this is so applicable to the context of systematic reviewing, because everything that you do in the process of a systematic review needs to be systematic. There are many review types. You heard Hannah describe a few that I've been involved in over the years. As there's systematic reviews of primary research data. There are systematic reviews of other reviews, which are called over reviews, and they are also known as umbrella reviews. You've got diagnostic reviews, which are diagnostic test accuracy reviews. We've got rapid reviews, scoping reviews, narrative reviews, qualitative reviews, and the list goes on. But my focus today will be on systematic reviews of primary research studies, predominantly qualitative ones. So there are some really experienced people in this early stage researcher training. So I'm going to just get a sense of who's in the room so that I know how best to, kind of communicate some of the discussions around this. So I think if I stop sharing, I'm just going to do a little poll and ask if you'd mind completing this, which indicates your experience in relation to conducting a systematic review. Great. Thanks, everyone. So I'm going to end it. So we've got quite a mix. Some people have never conducted one before. One person's working one just now, and 5 have conducted them in the past. So that's really helpful. Thank you. So I'll go back to sharing my slides. Okay, so for those of you who are working on one just now or have completed a systematic review in the past and the future systematic reviewers in the room, I am going to, tell you that you're all superheroes. So Spider-Man is well known, and his uncle Ben had advised him that with great power comes great responsibility. I'm just going to tweak this a bit and say that as a systematic reviewer, with great systematic reviewing comes great responsibility, because I see systematic reviews as a key function in sharing high quality summary of information for other people. So the emphasis should be not so much on, I need this paper for my PhD, or, I want to do a quick check of the literature. The function of a high quality systematic review is for you to do the legwork to save other people having to do it, or you doing the legwork that other people cannot do because of the situation they're in, or that they don't have a research post, but they need that summary of information and you're going to provide it for them. So I would encourage you in doing systematic reviews to work to identify all the relevant primary research to address a defined research question. So looking at published and unpublished data from any date range, if possible, in any language. And then the purpose of the systematic review is to critically appraise and evaluate that research that you've identified, bring it together in a high quality appraisal and synthesis of information. Now that can be a narrative synthesis, where you're presenting your work in a table perhaps, or you can progress then to a meta-analysis, which is the statistical bringing together of the data from that primary research. But technically speaking, meta-analysis is actually separate from systematic review. It's a second stage of a systematic review. They're not always one and the same thing. So why are systematic reviews so important these days? Well, I think systematic reviews are increasingly important against a landscape where there's increasing research information being produced and the availability of potentially relevant information. So to give you some context with this, or some data to back this up, this is data that we collect within the Cochrane Stroke Group. And what we do there is we monitor the publication of randomized control trials in the field of stroke, and we capture the number of Cochrane reviews, obviously, that we are supporting in the field of stroke, and we also monitor the availability of non-Cochrane reviews. And you can see that over the last 20 years, there's been this massive upsurge in the amount of literature being produced and published. And this isn't just in the context of stroke. You'll see this. I could have shown you different graphs that relate to across the research literature. It's across the globe, across the context, across clinical settings. So we as researchers or clinicians, or whatever background you're from, in engaging in this literature, you have more and more material to work through to be able to get a sense of what's out there and what the evidence base is. And there's more and more availability, not just in your own language, but in other languages. The risk is that with increasing volumes of information, there's also variability in the quality. So if you're engaging in that literature and you've got a huge number of papers to read, how do you know which is the better quality paper and the lesser quality one? And there's also, with that volume of information, a risk of duplication if people aren't aware of what the evidence base is saying at the moment across the board of papers and being published. There's a risk that someone will go out and do something that's already been done, or deliver an answer that we already know the answer to if we synthesize that information that's come before. So a top tip here is where that I see high quality systematic review having the potential to make really important contributions to the research evidence base. And it also acts as a foundation to enable future research to build on that and progress beyond the status quo where we are just now. And it also is key as a speech and language therapist. Those high quality systematic reviews are key to me as a speech and language therapist, so that I know what's going on in the research literature. Right, so my plan for today is to talk a little bit about the formulation of a research question and a systematic review, then progress to talking about planning of your systematic review, starting with the end in mind. I'll talk about the importance of balancing the scope of your review with the feasibility and ways in which you might think about doing that. Talk about the process of systematic searching, screening the data, bringing the data together in data synthesis and risk bias considerations. And then lastly, just a little bit about publication. And hopefully, and there'll be enough time for some questions and answers at the end. Okay, so outlining your review question is the next topic here. And before I talk more about that, I just want to highlight a concept called research waste to you. So if you're not familiar with this, there's a lovely series of papers published in The Lancet in 2014. And they highlight the great loss of information and effort and energy and costs to research that asks the wrong questions, that addresses questions that we already know the answers to, that's poorly designed, that's not adequately reported. And in many cases, or in some cases, I should say, we know the research has been conducted, we know it's been funded, but it's never published, and we don't know what's happened. We don't know what that information that has been gathered has actually achieved. So to flip that over then, for your research question, you want to ask the right question. You want to ask the clinically important question. You want to ensure that you have a high quality design and high quality reporting. And my top tip here is that, you know, I would encourage you to focus on these bullet points. You know, think about the important questions, the design and the quality reporting, and some of the other pressures that we might feel as academics around H indexes or citation rates or downloads and all the rest of it. That will look after itself if you do these bullet points. And for me, the bullet points are more important anyway. I want the, you know, clinically relevant and important research. That's what drives me. But if you're being pressured for the other things, these things will follow. And as an example of that, the Cochrane review of speech and language therapy for aphasia after a stroke has, I hope, embraced some of these points. And as a consequence, despite its, you know, being published in 2012 and 2016, it has continued to be one of the top downloaded reviews in the Cochrane stroke family over many years, even several years after its publication. And it's also cited in many of the international guidelines. So focus on those bullet points and everything else will look after itself. So what's your research question? So you need to make sure that your research question is a clinical priority, clinical and research priority. And you want to consider, will the findings address the questions that your reader has? Will they be able to act upon those findings? Do you really need this review? And has it been done before? And for me, the top tip is I always start with what's the problem I'm trying to address. And sometimes that's a clinical problem, and that's very easy. I can go back and, you know, put myself in the therapist head on and think, okay, what did I need to know as a speech and language therapist in order to be able to deliver better care for my patients? Or it might be a research problem. You know, it could be a methodological review you're doing. And again, you're putting yourself back. What does the researcher need to know to be able to do this task better? So in planning your review, you need to consider about your research question. And a great way to find out, is your aphasia research question a priority, is to have a look at Sue Franklin's work within CATS, which was identifying the top 10 research priorities relating to aphasia following stroke. And if it's not there, if your research question does not appear in that, then I would encourage you to go back to the beginning, rethink the question. If it is there, then you should progress to thinking about formulating it as a PICO question. And PICO stands for population, intervention, comparison, and outcome. Now, there's some variations on that. So if you have a methodological question, you might not have a population, it might be the problem. You know, the comparison may not always be relevant to your review, but I would start with that framework and work to populate that to describe your research question. Some people also add a couple of T's at the end, perhaps defining the type of study. You might be just looking at randomized controlled trials, for example, or it might be about a specific treatment approach or a prognostic method or methodological issue. My top tip here is to think about an answerable research question. So one example from my own experience is the field of preoperative fasting, where you are, if you're going for a general anesthetic, you're asked not to eat or drink 12 hours or 24 hours before your anesthetic. And that's because as you are anesthetized, there's a risk that food and fluid that might remain in your stomach might be regurgitated and then aspirated into your lungs, causing you lots of problems like pneumonia and even death. Sorry, this is probably not a great topic for first thing in the morning, but a group of researchers were interested in looking at this issue because they wanted to see to what extent variations in preoperative fasting would impact on the outcome of death. But actually, that's not going to be answerable because so few people actually die as a consequence of anesthetic and any kind of adverse event as a result of regurgitation, because your anesthetic team and the surgical team are so skilled at addressing an issue that might occur on anesthesia, that very, very few, I would say hardly any people actually die as a consequence of regurgitation, aspiration of food or fluid. So, developing a question where your outcome was death in that context is really not going to be answerable because this happens so rarely. So, if you've got the you've got your research question, you've developed your PICO. The next thing to do is to check, is it a duplication? Has somebody already done this? There are so many research questions out there in the field of aphasia that, I would encourage you to find something that somebody hasn't addressed already. We need to divide and conquer here to be able to advance our field. So one great way to check if somebody's already done this is to check the Prospero register. Now, Prospero stands for the International Prospective Register of Systematic Reviews, and it registers health, social care, public health, education, international development, systematic reviews where health is an outcome. It creates a unique ID and it becomes a permanent record of your systematic review, and it's searchable. So if you're interested in a particular topic, a particular question, you can actually go and check the register. And there's something like 58 different aphasia reviews in there already. I'll also highlight that you can actually register methodological reviews in Prospero too, as long as you can demonstrate the link to a health outcome. So we did this recently around methodological review, looking at advancing the forecasting of recruitment to randomized controlled trials in the context of stroke, because we were able to demonstrate that this would in turn have an impact on the quality of the information being produced, which in turn would affect health outcomes. So do consider the methodological reviews too. So once you've got your PICO, you might want to work to clarify your aims and objectives. And there's an acronym here about FINER, which is it feasible? Is it interesting? Is it novel, ethical and relevant? And I've scored out interesting because I think that should be priority, but then the acronym doesn't work so well anymore. But do work through these questions, and it's worth spending time on this to make sure that you've got this really clinically important question. The next issue is what I mentioned earlier about that need to balance. So, there's always other constraints on your time, on your budget, on, the resources that you have to hand. And so that feasibility of your ideal, ambitious research question with the, that's needed in the field, that's a priority, with balancing that with what you can do in the resources you have, particularly, as an early stage researcher. Now, there are ways in which you can do this quite effectively. And one example is the systematic review I mentioned, a methodological review looking at recruitment rates in randomized controlled trials. And we wanted to look at the factors that would improve the ability to forecast recruitment for different sites in stroke trials. So we wanted to search randomized controlled trials in stroke. Now, you remember that graph from earlier, we were talking about hundreds of randomized controlled trials. So this would make it quite an ambitious task, and trying to gather all of that data and synthesize it. But we were able to achieve that despite limited resources, because we worked to balance the number of trials that we aimed to bring together across languages and across time, with the amount of data points that we were going to gather from each of the trials. So in that particular example, we actually didn't need to know a lot about individual trials. We didn't need to know the comparisons. We didn't need to know a whole bunch of outcome data. What we were interested in was recruitment rates, target and recruitment, and information about the site and the trial itself. So actually, I think we had something like between 5 to 7 different data points for each of the, I think we had nearly 500 randomized control trials or more. So that meant that our research question and our research plan was much more feasible, despite a massive number of randomized controlled trials. So we could be quite ambitious in the number of trials that we brought into that review, not put any holes or bars on them, because we were being very precise about the data items that we needed for that review. Okay, so starting with the end in mind, it's important that you develop a really detailed protocol in advance of engaging with your systematic review. So I would encourage you to plan out the scope and the content, the analysis and the structure of your results before you actually engage with your data at all. Try to anticipate judgments and categories and decisions that you might have to make in relation to outcome measures or intervention categories. And the more you can define those the concepts and the categories in advance before you engage with your data, the easier it will be in applying those judgments later on. So if you're trying to make judgments when you're in the mess of the data, it becomes really difficult because the actual individual trials or the individual research project will pull you one way or the other. So it's much easier if you've decided that in advance with a clear head, if you like, and then you can go in and categorize with more ease. And it also avoids that potential for bias, and that you're making consistent decisions from the start and you're not changing that decision making halfway through. Okay, so I talked about the importance of developing a PICO question right at the beginning of your systematic review. You also need to do that at the level of the comparisons, so that each comparison that you're doing in your analysis also has a PICO. When you've developed all of that and mapped it out, because each of these sub-comparisons, if you like, will reflect a analysis and a results a section in results that you'll be reporting to. When you've done that, so you're mapping from the research question right through to the results, I would encourage you then to register your review with Prospero. The Prospero register is quite light touch. You can do that quite early on in your process. You don't have to have the, absolute minutiae of detail. So register your results as quick as you can. Or your protocol, your light touch protocol, as soon as you can, and saying, I'm intending to do this review, but then don't leave it there. Continue to develop your protocol for your own purposes and to guide your systematic review later. Okay, so I'm going to then highlight the importance of working within your team, developing a team to bring this review to conclusion. So I would encourage you to think about including the public and patients in your review process. So people with lived experience of aphasia, their family members, people with clinical experience. So depending on the topic of your question, you might want to include multidisciplinary healthcare team members, speech and language therapists, SLT assistants, but also include methodological experts. So you might want somebody, if you've not done a systematic review before, you might want to involve somebody who has. You might want to include a meta-analyst or a statistician that really understands meta-analysis. And I would really strongly encourage you to include an information specialist. I think it's a much neglected specialism, and I'll talk more about that in a bit. And if you've got a really ambitious and complex review where you're anticipating dealing with a lot of data, for example, individual participant data, you might also need a data manager, but that would be something that would need funded, I think, later on. So in designing reviews of complex interventions, which is often the case in speech and language therapy and aphasia, many of our interventions are very complex. And there are different ways of dealing with this in the context of a systematic review. They can be really challenging reviews, but that's all the more reason why you as superheroes are so important in doing these systematic reviews, because they're not something that you can do quickly. They're things that need time and focus to address. and to develop the summary for others. So the complexity can be dealt with in one of two ways, and it's known as broad lumping reviews, or you can have a narrow splitting review. And I think of Morpheus here asking Nemo to choose one of the two pills. So I'm going to declare that I do have quite strong bias here, and see if you can spot that as we progress through the slides. But there are two different ways of doing this, and you can choose one or the other. I think that the decisions that you make will impact on the clinical relevance of the systematic review that you deliver, and the accessibility of a comprehensive summary that, for me, I'm always thinking about the end reader and the information they need. But I'll explain more about that. So lumping versus splitting, the terminology comes from the days of Charles Darwin, where he and his colleagues and collaborators were working hard to develop a taxonomy for flora and fauna across the world. And there were some people who would bring, lots of different kinds of animals together in a single species, whereas others were separating them out based on minutiae of differences between them. So that's where the terminology comes from. And in a systematic review context, there are advantages and disadvantages with both approaches. So from a lumping point of view, you're bringing together a broad scope of interventions, perhaps in a single review. So it's very comprehensive. It can explore consistencies and generalizabilities across the intervention or the topic issue. It also allows you to make comparisons across a range of different interventions within the same systematic review. So the reader has that work done for them. The disadvantages are that it becomes more time-consuming, and it will require more resources. And sometimes just reading a complex review like that can be a bit more difficult, because you're having to interpret across many comparisons and potentially patient groups too. A splitting review is where you take a focus on a really narrow comparison. So to give you an example of this, so a lumping review might be the speech and language therapy for aphasia after stroke Cochrane review, where we aim to encompass all types of speech and language therapy interventions, different dosages, and so on. The splitting review would be something that's really narrow. So it would be like saying telerehabilitation for people with stroke receiving telerehabilitation compared to face-to-face rehabilitation 6 months post-stroke, and they're looking at their outcomes on language. So it's very, very narrow. The benefits of that approach is that it's easier to write and definitely easier to read. It's got very simplified objectives and comparisons. You might only have one. But the problem with that approach is that you've got very sparse evidence then, because you've got tiny number of trials looking at a really narrow question. And you cannot there compare and contrast between different groups of patients potentially, or different types of therapy. And it's difficult to retrieve information like that across multiple split reviews. There's also potential risk of bias if you've got multiple split reviews in a single field of science. It makes it difficult to compare and contrast across them, but it also suggests that there may be more evidence than there actually is, because these multiple split reviews may be based on the same 10 trials. And so in some ways that actually reduces the accessibility of the evidence summaries, and it also leads to some healthcare uncertainties if one split review is saying X is better than Y, and another split review is actually saying, well, Y is better than X. So as a therapist, that makes it really difficult to judge which one I should believe. Okay, so I also think that the splitting reviews there's also a risk of salami slicing science here, where you have a large clinical topic, the clinician or the researcher that's engaging with this topic wants to get this overview, but instead you get these tiny slices of reviews in the field. So it's something to be aware of. And within Cochrane, we would always work to try and avoid that. So we would encourage people to get in touch and communicate with other reviewers to try and bring information together into single reviews. Okay, so I'm going to launch another poll just to ask you about, whether or not you would ever submit a manuscript to 2 journals simultaneously. Okay, great. So I'm going to share that. So overwhelmingly, we're saying no, and that's pretty clear. I think one person said maybe, which is also true in some very specific circumstances, you might actually submit to 2 journals, but that would always be in consultation with the editorial teams in both journals. It might be a landmark paper, so it's a very rare specific issue that there's lots of transparency about before you actually submit the journal. So the vast majority of us would never do it, and we don't do that because we know there's a risk if we do of duplicate publication, that it's unethical, that you would we just don't do it. But yes, we seem to have no problem. Sorry, I'm saying that very generally, but I think we need to be mindful of that when we're looking at reviews. So
Marian, I'm raising my hand there just because it might be timely to respond to Sam's query there in the chat, just as you're going along.
Oh, sorry, I can't see the chat. I'm sorry.
Yeah, no problem at all. It's just about gathering data relevant to the research question. Sam, would you like to unmute your mic there, and just because it might be just timely where we're at in the presentation?
Yeah, hi, everybody. So actually, my question was regarding, Marian, do you think that there might be a minimum threshold for the amount of literature, however you might measure that, necessary before embarking on a systematic review? This was in regard to the salami slicing that you talked about just a moment ago.
Right, sorry, Sam, I'm looking at your question, but your question in the chat, but the question is about getting a sense of how much literature is out there in a review for reviewing before you actually start the review. Is that?
Yeah, that's right. Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So great question. I didn't mention it. So it would be about piloting your searching to get a sense of how much is out there. In some cases, so the example I gave of the methodological review, we had a good sense of how many stroke trials were out there because we had the data from Cochrane Stroke. So sometimes there are collations of information already available. If that's not available, if it's a more specific issue, it's about piloting your search strategy and getting a sense of how many RCTs are out there before doing your full systematic review. So that would be what I would advise.
And sorry, just to continue on there, do you think there's a minimum amount of literature that you should be looking at, a minimum number of studies on a particular, in a particular topic area before trying to synthesize evidence from those studies?
Oh, I don't think I think the minimum would be 2 if you wanted to bring them together. But then, is that really a question that's needed if there are only 2 trials in the field, or if there are only 2 primary research studies? It's kind of easier then. It's probably maybe not a priority research question coming back to that need. How important is it? How clinically needed is that issue? If there are only 2 trials that you want to bring together, that's something that is easier for a reader to do just by looking at both of them. But technically, it only takes, you can bring together and synthesize 2 trials. And anything more than that, yeah. Okay.
I was just going to add, I've definitely come across a couple of papers that I'm pretty sure were systematic reviews where they, wrote out an entire systematic review protocol and then reported that there was nothing or not much, which obviously doesn't allow for synthesis of results. But I suppose sometimes that's interesting in itself, particularly if it is a question that is important and is perhaps it's important, particularly important because there's not much research that's been done on it yet.
Yeah. Yeah, so that, yes, absolutely. So kudos to them for publishing that, to say, look, we did all this, and because always publish, even if, you don't feel there's anything in it, you're sharing information, you're sharing where you got to as a consequence of all this work that you invested in it. And yes, there is a function in systematic reviews to say we need to do more. Yeah, so, and Sam, I'm also seeing your point in the chat, which is, I think, a slightly different issue, is about the amount of data as you are extracting the information. I think is, yeah, so the same, so the way I deal with that is, again, by working in a lot of detail with the protocol and anticipating the data that I really need. So the good example of that was the methodological review, where we needed to be really specific to be able to accommodate the large number of trials we were anticipating. So we worked right through the comparisons to the end results, and we were able to weed out stuff that we really didn't need. Now, it meant that there were no frills on the review that we did, but it did mean that we could address the key research question and the outcomes that we were interested in.
Thanks, Marian. And there will be more time for questions at the end. It was just that this was kind of timely where you were at in the presentation. Thanks, Marian.
Okay. So we come back to John later. Okay. Right. So duplicate reviews. So we were talking about how many of you would submit the same manuscript to 2 journals simultaneously, and yet what we're seeing in the review literature is that there are many duplicate reviews published, or significantly overlapping reviews. So this work published in BMJ in 2013 looked at systematic reviews that were published across the year, and found that of the 73 reviews they examined, 49 of them had at least one or more partial or completely overlapping analysis. And it wasn't that the reviews were an update. And in fact, the same author was involved in 2 or more of those overlapping reviews. So, there's so many research questions that we need answered. I would encourage you to find the unique research questions that have been neglected, the under-researched issues, to advance our field in a more efficient way. Okay. Right. So as an example of this, my colleagues that I work with here in our research unit are interested in the topic of urinary incontinence. So that's what UI stands for. This might be too much information, but for some people, but it's urinary incontinence is a big issue after stroke, and in stroke fields it's very much either the realm of the physiotherapist, where they look at physical rehabilitation to address this issue, or it might be the realm of the nursing staff, where they're looking at behavioral interventions. And so for physical rehabilitation, it might be pelvic floor exercises or yoga or lifestyle changes. For nursing, it might be prompt voiding or time voiding, which are very similar interventions indeed. And within Cochrane, we have 11 different Cochrane reviews addressing physical rehabilitation interventions, and we have 9 addressing behavioral interventions. So if you're a nurse and you want to look at this issue, you have 9 different Cochrane reviews to read and try and bring that data together to make a decision. For this patient, do I ask them to engage with prompt avoiding, habit retraining, time voiding? Similarly, the physio will be looking at, I think there's something like 5 different Cochrane reviews on pelvic floor interventions, all on slightly different patient groups, all on slightly different issues in relation to pelvic floor interventions. And not only that, but there are 3 different overarching reviews that look at all the interventions related to urinary incontinence, or all the conservative prevention and management. And what's more is that beneath these multiple reviews, it's actually the same trials mostly across all of them that are just being repackaged and reformatted and put together in slightly different ways. So this is something that we're working to avoid within our field. Okay. So you've identified your problem, you've checked Prospero, nobody else is doing it, you're formulating your unique systematic review PICO and comparison PICOs, you've considered the feasibility issues, and you've drafted your protocol, and you've registered it in Prospero. So now what? well, you go out and start searching for your data. And key to this is thinking about rubbish in, rubbish out. And there's a concept that comes from computing science, where if you've got rubbish coding, you're going to get nothing coming out the other end. So it also applies in systematic reviews that the better quality the material you have coming into your systematic review, the better your results, the quality of your results will be. And so the quality of your data and your searching will impact on your results of your review and the quality of your review. So it's important to develop your search strategy to find relevant research and work with your team members, your multidisciplinary team members sorry, somebody saying on the way to school saying goodbye. Think about the databases that you're engaging in and what you know about those databases, and develop your specific search string for each of these databases. And the search syntax can often change in your database on a surprisingly regular basis. And that's why I'm encouraging you to engage with your information specialist. So academic librarians and universities are excellent at this, as are hospital-based librarians. They're so used to this, and they're fully engaged and up to speed with the different languages of search strings for different databases. The other thing to highlight is, you'll all be familiar with databases like Medline and CINAHL, Embase, and the others. But I just wanted to flag up something here, which is around the electronic platforms that you use to engage with those databases. So the two big ones would be Ovid and EBSCO. And it's just a note of caution, really, from experience, where I had conducted a number of Cochrane reviews decades ago, and all the searching syntax and search strings have been developed, and we had accessed our databases via Ovid at that point in time. When it came to time to update those Cochrane reviews, the university had changed its electronic platform to EBSCO, and none of our search strings would work. We had to start all over again. We had to actually engage specialist information specialists to translate our search string from Ovid to an EBSCO one. So it is really specialist work. I'd also encourage you to engage with the grey literature wherever you can. So what is the grey literature? That is unpublished data or any kind of information that's been published in a format that's not an electronic formal submission to a peer-reviewed academic journal. So it might be research reports, conference proceedings, theses, preprints, but also policy documents and blogs. All of these are come under the grey literature badge. The search interfaces for grey literature tend to be very basic. So you might be searching with one term, or maybe two, maybe three at most. But at the same time, you still apply your systematic process where you record your search string and the dates of searching, and you plan and engage in those interfaces as best you can. It's important to consider the quality, because it isn't peer-reviewed academic material, and the potential biases in relation to that. But the benefits are significant in that it's a very broad-based search. You will get many more references or records being generated that you'll have to screen, but you can find really key emerging information that you see through the grey literature search that you won't necessarily see in the formal peer-reviewed academic journals just yet, but it's coming up on the horizon. It's also a good way to identify research that never makes it to publication. So research that might have neutral results that for whatever reason is never reported in an academic journal. And that's really key to avoiding publication bias in your systematic review. So another way to supplement your search strategy is, and has been shown to improve the quality of searching, is citation tracking. So it's really important where the topic area that you're working in uses lots of different terminology, and it might be difficult to find the right keywords in the various databases that you're searching. So forward citation tracking is where you found a potentially relevant paper that you think is going to be included in your review, and you then check for the additional references that are citing that paper. And there are ways in which you can do this through Scopus, the Web of Science. You also have backward citation tracking, where you take the paper that you believe you plan to include in your review, and you check the reference list, because they may in turn have cited another paper that's relevant to your review, but you haven't found through other searching processes. So this next point is something that's really emerging and becoming much more aware of, particularly as a consequence of CATS, I think, and we're becoming much more aware of how the predominance of English language data in aphasia research. And there are lots of reasons for that, around about research funding, the publication process itself, access to assessment tools, and so on, can all be a source of a reason for why we've got so much English language aphasia research data. But it's important in conducting your systematic review that you're not also placing barriers on the inclusion of research into your systematic review from languages other than English, if you're working in that language. So have a think about your search strategies and the extent to which you have used English terms to identify things like aphasia, and to what extent the databases you're working with are focused on English language publications. And what I would encourage you to do is to think about applying some highly sensitive search filters to try and identify the non-English language materials available in your field. So Cochrane produced low to middle income country filters developed with the World Health Organization that you can use through Ovid and through Central. The World Health Organization itself maintains a global health library. It's called Global Index Medicus, and it is an access route to subsections of the databases for African publications, those from Middle Eastern, Eastern Mediterranean regions, Southeast Asia, Latin American, Caribbean regions, and Western Pacific regions. There's also a really great database called LILACs, which is focused on Latin American and Caribbean health sciences literature. And then the Web of Science also has different databases for Latin America, China, Korea, and Russia. So you may do all of these additional searches, you might find very little, but the quality of your search strategy will be so much more enhanced, and you are not placing language barriers on your systematic review process. If the material isn't out there, then it's not because you didn't try and find it, it's because it's not there yet. So you've conducted your search and you've now got all these records that you need to sift through, and the standard process is for two independent reviewers to screen the titles and the abstracts and eventually the full text. The title and abstract historically was done separately, but increasingly now some of the software that's available will encourage you to do two at the same time, and then progress to full text review. Definitely get two people to do this where you can. It improves the quality of the screening. And I would always apply screening questions that are quite formal, and I apply those in a systematic way. And they're really just a version of your inclusion criteria. So for example, Cochrane review of SLT for aphasia after stroke, it was, is this paper, does it have people with aphasia? Is it about stroke-related aphasia? Is intervention SLT? Is the comparison the right one? Does it measure language? Is it an RCT? And if that answer is yes, then you progress and it becomes included in the review. If it's no, you exclude it, but with a reason. And you're monitoring your decisions all the way through using the Prisma diagram. So hope you can see the cursor there. So this central part here would be what the Prisma flowchart would look like. But I've presented this here, this slightly adapted version from the Campbell Systematic Review Collaboration, because there's increasing acceptance of this slightly broader flowchart where you can map the where you identified additional studies through your citation tracking, for example. I'd also encourage you to engage with data management software. I'm not going to recommend one or over the other, but there's a nice comparison chart, excuse me, in Wikipedia that you might want to have a look at if you haven't identified particular software just yet. Okay, so gathering the data, where you are going to extract your data information from across the studies. You're considering all the relevant variables. In designing your data extraction tool, I would encourage you to look at some of the checklists that will help you identify which of the variables that are relevant to you. So things like tidier, if you're interested in the various interventions. Our own aphasia describe study for aphasia participant descriptors, the Roman study if you're thinking about outcome measurement instruments, to so that really is helpful in populating or developing your data extraction tool. Be systematic. Pilot the tool, refine it, adjust it. If you're working with other people, make sure they pilot it too. An important point is make sure that it's the study that's individually profiled, not the papers. So it happens regularly that papers are not always papers are identified as opposed to the foundational study. This is just an example of what the data extraction tool might look like. For me, I use Excel a lot. I use color to keep me on track. This is quite a simple one. There's not a lot with to extract in relation to patient demographics, but so you tailor it based on your endpoint. So you're gathering all possible sources of data for every study. And so for a single study, you might be drawing information from abstracts, protocols, trial registration information, and the final published papers. You compare and contrast across these sources, looking for additional pieces of information that may not have made it into the final results paper. So just top tips would be to I often think at this stage that when I'm data extracting that there's no room for grey. I'm trying to establish, is this paper in or is it out? It can't sit on the fence. Is this intervention relevant for this category or not? So you have to make a decision, yes or no. And that, I think I find it helpful to think of that sometimes. I also typically extract the quality data at the data extraction stage. And it took me a while to realize that that's okay to do, because oftentimes the literature in this field suggests that it's a separate process. So the analysis of it, or the consideration of risk of bias, which is based on the quality data, is a separate process. But the actual gathering of that information, I always do at the data extraction stage. There are many mechanisms, increasingly so, where you don't necessarily maybe have to do that data extraction yourself, but actually I think is an important stage, an important way for you to get familiar with your data, to really get a sense of the trial that's going to be feeding through to your results, and it then enables you to really understand the data that's behind the results that are coming through. In the same way that with qualitative data, that whole transcription or the engagement with the data is really important to understanding it. So enter some data for every cell where you can in your data extraction form, and be careful over whether it's labeled as unreported, unavailable, unclear, not applicable, because actually those are quite different things. If it's unreported, it might be something you want to go and track down. And the next question is, how far do you go to track it down? So I would always contact the study authors to obtain that data. It's often just a slight, editing issue that the information didn't come through, or it may be that I've missed it. It might be there and I just didn't see it. By having that additional data, it increases the precision of your work and reduces the risk of reporting biases. And also approach with some understanding rather than an accusatory tone, because these final results papers may have gone through 5, 10 versions, so it's not unknown that something falls off the list when they're trying to fit 10-year trial into 5,000 words. So bringing the data together, I'm really aware of the time, so I'm going to speed up here, but I'm not emphasizing this too much, but I think there's an opportunity here for a whole other session around meta-analysis. But meta-analysis is the next stage in a systematic review where you're bringing together this statistical information from those trials and synthesizing that together. The advantages are that it improves precision, it can answer questions that the primary research may not necessarily have done, and it can also serve to address for the reader some controversies perhaps in the field where one trial is saying one thing and another one is saying something else. It's important in planning your meta-analysis to anticipate the nature of the data, whether it's dichotomous data or more usually in our field, it's continuous data, and consider the analysis plan with that in mind. Okay, and if a study has no data or there's missing data, that's just not going to feature in your meta-analysis. There's no way to include that. And so it's important to try and gather that data and bring it in as best you can. Consider heterogeneity across the studies, both clinical heterogeneity and statistical heterogeneity, and try and find out why that might be. And meta-analysis, random effects can accommodate some heterogeneity, but not, you don't want too much of it. And use sensitivity analysis to check whether decisions you made in the planning of your systematic review is having an impact on, or could have had an impact on your results. So if you decided to include registry data sets, you might want to take those out from the other trial-based data to see if that impacts on the results, as an example. Risk of bias, I'm going to skip that poll, is looking at the quality of the data coming into your review. The big ones, if you're looking at randomized controlled trials, are selection bias, performance bias, and detection bias. You can profile it by trial, just as you can see an example here on the left, or it can be profiled in relation to each outcome that you're looking at. So you can see the traffic light system there. Or you can profile it across a database or across a comparison. And it's not just relating to randomized controlled trials. You can see an example here for randomized controlled trials. So not every form of bias may be relevant to each type of data, but I would encourage you to think about it and profile that, so it really gives the reader insight into the quality of the data that you're bringing together. Importantly, it's not just about the quality coming into your systematic review, but it's also about the quality of your review. So I would also encourage you to think about meta biases, and that's biases that are at the top level systematic review. Robust is a really great tool, a nice prompt for considering different kinds of bias, like ecological bias, selection bias, publication bias, and so on. And it will support you in describing and discussing those issues in relation to your systematic review. And lastly, publication and dissemination. Always publish. But I think it's something that's unique to systematic reviews, is that there is a best before date or a use by date, and that's always based on the date of your last search. And for particularly large reviews that's taken you a long time to get to this stage of publication, you might have to do a quick top-up search, integrate any new results to make sure that you're publishing something that's really current by the end of the process. It's also something in the context of PhDs. Be careful about the systematic review question you're using and where it occurs in your PhD process, because if it's something about the evidence base in the field and you've done it as your first study, by the time you get to the end of your PhD and submitting a thesis, you might have to update that systematic review process. I think you can be careful about the question you're asking and the way it's formatted and presented within your PhD, to mean that so that you hopefully don't have to update it several times throughout your PhD when you've got lots of other things to do. Use the checklist, the Prisma checklist, to ensure that's a high quality report. And it's not just one checklist, particularly in our field. You might be looking at an abstract and Prisma, maybe individual participant data Prisma. So there are many different reporting criteria. Complex interventions is one that we're using all the time, so Prisma CI. And think about other reporting templates as well. So in the recent release work, I think I was working across something like 8 or 9 different reporting checklists. So it can be laborious and time consuming, but the benefits at the end of the day of a really well reported study are well worth the time and investment. And just lastly, there are other types of data synthesis that I've not touched on at all. So you might be looking at qualitative data, and there are methods around bringing that data together. And there are different types of approaches to mixed methods data integration. And I'm sorry to fly through all of that, but I am aware of the time. So just to end, clinicians and health service users really need systematic, high-quality summaries of the increasing output in relation to research evidence and evidence synthesis across multiple trials, and where there's a field where there are multiple split reviews, that's really needed for them, that they can read one document and get a sense of the whole field. And if you're looking for funding to support your work, then the funding will typically prioritize high quality, up-to-date summaries wherever possible of key priority issues. And I think that CATS has a vital coordination role in all of this work. And that's me.
Thanks so much, Marian. That was fantastic. And you've actually answered all the questions in the chat as you went along. So that's brilliant as well. There is a query about whether or not the slides and would be available, and the answer to that is that the recording will be available via the CATS website. So the recording will be available for people to access afterwards. In the interest of time, I'm going to take one question. If somebody has a burning issue that they'd like to check or ask Marian about, or a comment maybe.
Could I just ask before that,
Sure.
if everybody could turn on their cameras so I could take a screenshot?
Oh yeah, sorry. Thanks, Anna.
Just a sec. Yeah, not everybody's on, but soon maybe. Okay. I've taken one. Anybody else being able to turn on their cameras? Okay, let's have it this way. Thank you.
Thanks, Anna. So maybe one question, if there's a question or a comment for Marian. And you can unmute your mic if you'd like to just speak directly.
I think John wanted to ask the question.
Yes. John?
I see his hand up now.
Great, thanks,
Yeah,
John.
if that's okay. First of all, thanks, Marian. I'm not sure there's a grant or a paper on aphasia in the world that doesn't cite, your review. So it's really great to hear your tips straight up. So thank you. My comment earlier was just that, for me at least, every review I've been involved in, no matter how carefully we think about inclusion and exclusion criteria and think, yep, that covers it. Inevitably, when the results come in, there are these edge cases, these kind of grey areas where the papers, we then realise that we haven't thought of this or that. I don't know if you've experienced that, and if you deal with that by revising the criteria to account for these edge cases, or just exclude if it's not completely clear.
So yes, yes, definitely. You do come across these, and it's not just about the paper. Sometimes about the intervention, or some subtleties in it, isn't it? That it's about that categorization. I think that to some extent it can be addressed by that pilot searching that I mentioned to Sam earlier. But inevitably, there's the paper or a combination of factors that you haven't anticipated. I do try and keep that. There's no grey, and that I try and. I need to make a decision here. Does it fit the original definition or not? And if it's a not, it's probably going to get excluded. And I'm always reluctant to change something that I set up in advance, unless there's a really good reason. And I'm trying to think of an example. Have you got an example, John? Or
I can't think of one, but follow-up question then would be, do you run a pilot search and then pilot screen on those, or is it just because maybe I've done it with papers that I think will be included and they're too clear cut and they're not actually the difficult ones?
I think the pilot searches I would run those a few times in order to develop the search strategy. So I will potentially find papers that I wouldn't be aware of, by doing that.
Right.
But inevitably, I'm just thinking, I think the examples I've often had are, sometimes papers in, not the mainstream journals, or from different parts of the world where the terminology is slightly different or the clinical context is slightly different, and so the descriptions of interventions can be slightly different. Sometimes I can resolve that by forcing it into a category and saying, okay, this is definitely in or it's definitely out. Or sometimes it's about engaging with the authors to establish, well, you said you did this, does this mean, and which would parallel with the inclusion criteria that we had. So definitely, I mean, some of the randomization processes, for example, can be something that we didn't. A good example would be, there was a randomization process where it was described as having an urn and different colored balls in the urn, and they had to pull out the balls. So that was slightly something offbeat, but it was random, and I'm pretty sure we included that one.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Marian. And just in the interest of time, and we know you're all busy people, if there are any further questions, you can email myself or Hannah, and we can pass on the questions to Marian. Is that okay?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, and I see Spirodula. So Spirodula, if you just want to email me, that's fine.
I just want, you can't see me probably because there is something wrong with our camera. We are three people here watching you. Thank you very much. Will this be available to us?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. Thank you.
It'll be available via the CATS website. So,
okay, great.
Yeah. So
Thanks.
you'll be able to, I plan to watch it back myself as well, to be honest. It was so good. So thanks so much, Marian, and thanks to everyone for their participation in the chat and for their questions and for turning up at whatever time you were at in your country this morning or this evening. It was really good to have you. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for the chance to talk about the topic. Thank you.